In order to develop a successful recovery plan for our industry, it requires a stable economic and political operating environment. The Forest Products Association of Canada suggests that to achieve this, we need to transform Canada's forest products industry, and we'll need the assistance of government support and programming. This plan for transformation involves integrating the traditional forest industry with emerging technologies. When John's ready, I would like to introduce John Fleming as Director of Economics and Trade Policy with the Forest Products Association of Canada, and he's going to help us examine some of the opportunities emerging for Canada's forest products industry. Okay, you're all set? Well, thanks, John. I know he's flown from Ottawa to be here, so let's listen up.
I'm all set, Jed. I know Todd had a clicker for the screen. Do we still have that, or? That was his own. Okay. Well, I can manage without it. So. Okay. Well, thank you, Jed, for that introduction, and thanks to everyone in the room for indulging me for a few minutes this afternoon as I try to give you some perspective on the things that we're working on at the Forest Products Association of Canada to help build Canada's next generation forest products industry. I noticed the theme of this afternoon's session is about industry economics and politics, and those two have really seen a real convergence over the course of the last few years, particularly through the downturn and as our industry has struggled. So I want to talk a bit about what that means in practical terms today, some of the observations we're making and how we're responding to that. And just a note about FPAC, we're probably really well positioned to comment on these things because at our core, the Forest Products Association of Canada is a lobbying or government relations firm, and what we really focus on doing is advocating economic and social policies to all levels of government, but the federal government in particular, about building a forest products industry that's more economically competitive. So the theme for this afternoon fits well with what we do at FPAC. And whether you like it or not, the government's hands are all over our industry. Politicians meddle in what we do all the time because, of course, the province owns and regulates the fiber supply. They regulate energy and energy markets, the environment, trade, the list goes on. So I'll try and touch base on a few of these things today in my presentation. So just to outline for you where I want to go with this, just a brief introduction about who we are at FPAC and what we do. I want to talk to you about some of the things that are influencing the forest products sector today and we think will continue to impact the industry into the future. I want to talk to you about how we're responding to those forces. And then I want to drill down a bit on a project we call the Biopathways Project. It's something we've been working on at FPAC for the last year or so that sort of charts a path for the industry in terms of pursuing opportunities in the bioeconomy, which I think you folks may have been talking a bit about today already. So I want to tell you what that project is all about. If all goes according to plan, my presentation should take 25 minutes, half an hour, which should leave us ample time for questions and answers. So, about FPAC, well, as the slide says, FPAC is the voice of the Canadian forest products industry on public policy issues at the national and international level, and our vision is to be the leader in advancing the global competitiveness and sustainable stewardship of the industry. We have 21 member companies from coast to coast. Our members tend to be the bigger integrated companies. We have, I believe, 6 member companies either headquartered or operating here in Alberta, including West Fraser, Canfor, Tolko, Alpac, DMI, and I believe Weyerhaeuser. So into the nuts and bolts of the presentation. So the global forest product industry is changing. Well, no surprise there. Anyone who's been in the industry for the last 5 years or more certainly knows that nothing is static in our industry. Things are changing at an accelerated rate. With boom-bust cycles, we're seeing the industry changing even faster than anyone anticipated a few years ago, to the point where it may be fair to say that our industry is transforming before our very eyes. And you've all heard tell of this notion of a perfect storm that's been impacting our industry. You know what the components are. Todd touched on some of them. A collapsed housing market in the U.S., a high Canadian dollar, the mountain pine beetle. The list goes on. If it's a problem in the economy, it's impacted us. We've had a really rough ride. But at FPAC, we look to several what we refer to as mega trends that are really influencing the industry now, we think will continue to influence the industry into the future. And I've got them here in bullets, and I want to speak to each of them individually just for a few seconds each. So the first one, Mark, it's probably better labeled demand. And you think about what's happening with respect to global demographics and populations over the course of the next 20 years. We're expected to add about another, well, essentially another China to the world's population, another 1.4 billion people in the next 20 years. At the same time, we expect global GDP to double and per capita incomes in emerging economies like China and India to triple. So that means a lot of organic demand for forest products. You think of those 1.4 billion people all buying textbooks for their kids, or blowing their noses, or putting up a bookshelf, or who knows, maybe even building a wood-framed house. That's a lot of organic demand. And so we're confident that the demand for forest products over the course of the next 20 years is going to grow. It may shift from one region of the globe to the other, and that's likely to happen. But we should take solace in the fact that people are going to continue to need our product. So that raises the next point, supply. And this question isn't quite as easy to answer. But we do know one thing for sure, and that is that you need land to grow a tree. And there are a couple trends related to the changing demographics and population trends in the world that are influencing land use globally. First of all, when these 1.4 billion people start making more money, one of the first things people want to do when they move from subsistence farming to the modern economy is supplement their diets with protein. It requires a lot of land to do that. In fact, it takes 10 times as much land to raise a pig or a chicken or a cow than it does to grow the cereals that they're accustomed to eating. A second trend that's really influencing land use globally is the growing demand for biofuels and renewable fuels. And if governments across the globe come anywhere close to supplying the amount of biofuels they plan on, then there's going to be a really tight crunch on land use. In fact, the United Nations anticipates that when you couple the demand for food with inputs for biofuels, that we'll need about 500 million more arable acres of land globally in the next 20 years. But at the same time, they say there's probably only 250 million available. So that has a few consequences. And one thing it may mean for our industry is in countries where their forest industry is based on plantation forestry, for example, perhaps Brazil, where they're using lots of land to grow eucalyptus, maybe they'll withdraw they'll start using that land to grow food and inputs for fuel as opposed to fiber. So we think that's a positive working for us as well, given our endowments of forest resources in Canada and our natural forests, our land not usable for agriculture. So we think we're well positioned to satisfy that demand in the years ahead. The third trend that's really changing the nature of the game is environmentalism. This new global ethic of environmentalism can really work to our advantage. As an industry, our record is really strong on the environment, and we've come a long way in the last 20 years with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, water use, particulate emissions, the list goes on. And it's something that when we're doing international marketing, be it in Europe or China or other parts of the globe, it's one attribute of Canadian products that we're really pushing. And because there is growing demand for sustainable products, we figure it will favor us well going forward, and it's really one of our key marketing strengths. The final point, role of government, maybe a bit more obscure than the rest, but one consequence of the economic downturn over the course of the last 24 months has been, as Todd mentioned, governments really intervening in their economies in massive ways, be it through bailing out financial institutions, auto sectors, regulating this, that, or the other thing. The list goes on. And one thing we all know about governments, when they start poking their nose somewhere, they have a really hard time withdrawing from that. And so we see governments increasingly involved in our business. So GR, government relations, I think is a critical capacity for the industry. And so we think it'll be increasingly important to work with governments to make sure that their interventions in the economy are strategic and, on a good day, helping our industry, and at the very least, not doing something to harm our industry. So based on these things and things you folks see in the industry on a day-to-day basis, it's obvious the industry is changing at a very rapid rate, and if we don't change with it, then, well, the consequences may be quite dire. So Just a quick spotlight on the Alberta industry. Your forest products industry is a bit more weighted towards lumber and OSB than other regions of the country, so that makes the U.S. housing collapse a bit tougher on you folks, of course, and of course because lumber markets aren't quite as diversified as pulp markets, for example. Selling a lot of your product into the U.S., the Canadian dollar is, well, it's hurting everybody, but the situation in Alberta may be a bit worse than in other regions. So we've identified what the issues are, what the trends are, so what are we doing about them? Well, first thing, we recognize that things are changing really quickly and that we need to change with them. And FPAC member companies in particular have been pursuing a four-pronged strategy to respond to the changing competitive landscape. And I've listed 4 key components of that strategy here, and I'll get into them in subsequent slides. But at the highest level, we're talking about enhancing our competitiveness and productivity, diversifying our markets, capitalizing on our green credentials, and changing the way we do business, and in fact, changing the business that we're in. So we figure at FPAC and our member companies feel that if we pursue all 4 of these strategies in concert, we can transform with the times and build an industry that's viable over the long term, capable of sustaining jobs and profits. So to each of these 4 bullets individually, quickly if I could. As the slide says, as an industry, we're constantly enhancing our competitiveness, always striving to do things leaner and meaner. And on the solid wood side in particular, the story in Canada is really strong. In fact, the sawmilling sector is the only sector of the Canadian economy that outperforms our U.S. counterparts in terms of productivity enhancements over the course of the last 10 years. And why that's important will become evident a bit later in my presentation, but it's because we've been making wise investments in R&D, machinery and equipment, and information technologies. And these things have led to greater efficiency and in some cases new products that are higher up the value chain, and so those are all good things. The story is a bit less compelling on the pulp and paper side, but we're confident that with the push from industry and some help from governments that through programs like the Pulp and Paper Green Transformation Program that we can once again build a world-leading pulp and paper sector. But of course, we can't rest on our laurels in this regard in terms of enhancing our competitiveness. At FPAC, we're working on a number of fronts to ensure the federal government in particular is doing things to help our member companies and the industry at large make it a bit easier for them to do business. And so we advocate for changes in tax policy, for example, that make it easier for our member companies to invest in machinery and equipment or undertake critical R&D. We're advocating for changes to fiber tenure policies and appropriation policies, encouraging the government to be smart on environmental regulations with respect to air, water, etc. Be smart about energy, recognize what we can do on the clean and green energy front. For the love of God, do something about the rail monopolies. These guys are killing us, so work with us in changing that. And increasingly, it's something that we found ourselves advocating on in the course of the last 12 to 18 months in particular, is encouraging the government to respond to threats from outside our borders like they did in response to the black liquor tax credit in the U.S. I'm pretty confident in saying that the Canadian government wouldn't have responded with their $1 billion if FPAC wasn't pushing them to do so. The second component, the second prong of the strategy, diversifying markets, this is pretty straightforward, and Todd spoke to the necessity of this. You may already know that Canada is already the world's most successful forest exporting nation. We export more forest products around the globe than any other country. And our sector is already Canada's largest exporter to Asia. The Chinese market is growing for us. We've got some work to do there. But like the case with competitiveness and productivity, we can't rest on our laurels. We have to go further, faster. We have to continue to grow the pie and chase growth markets in Asia and in non-residential applications for our products right here in North America. Industry-government partnership is critical in this regard because the nature of diversifying these markets is long-term in nature. It's risky. It often involves government-to-government communication, which, of course, individual companies don't have the capacity to do. And the government is increasingly playing a role in this. They recognize the value, and we're starting to see some successes. Lumber exports into China over the course of the last couple of years have been quadrupling on an annual basis, so that's good. But we think we can go a lot further. The third point, capitalizing on our green credentials. As I mentioned, the increasing global environmental ethics serves us well. There's a verifiable demand for, a growing demand for green products. In fact, a lot of our biggest customers, Canadian forest products industry's biggest customers, are increasingly demanding verifiable green credentials as a condition of sale. Companies like Home Depot, Lowe's, Sears, Land's End, before they'll sign a deal, sign on the dotted line, they want some assurances that the products they're buying are produced in a sustainable and green way. And FPAC members in particular have some advantage in this regard, and that's because when a company signs on to be a member of the Forest Products Association, they sign on to our sustainability initiative and its associated principles. And those principles, some of those principles are listed here, like a commitment to zero illegal logging, a commitment to certify all lands under management to one of the 3 certification schemes, a commitment to recycle. Our track record on greenhouse gases is incredible, and we've made a commitment to go further with that, in fact, to be carbon neutral across the complete value chain by 2015 without the purchase of carbon offsets. So we see this as maybe a tangible way that we have a leg up on the competition, and as I mentioned before, this is something we're really pushing in international markets with some of our big customers. In particular, is the green nature of the Canadian forest products industry. This is a standard slide you'll see in any FPAC presentation that me or any of my colleagues gives, and this is just to highlight some of the work we've done in the environment. This graphs our performance on greenhouse gases versus the Canadian economy on the whole. And you'll see the top line is the Canadian economy on the whole, up 26% over the last 20 years, and FPAC companies' greenhouse gas performance have done almost 10 times Kyoto over the same time frame. So our record on the environment and greenhouse gases in particular, very strong. So pursuing those 3 previous strategies, all necessary to changing and adapting to the competitive landscape, but probably not sufficient to achieve the level of transformation required to build a competitive and sustainable forest products industry. I think it's fair to say that increasingly companies are recognizing that traditional forest products business model isn't sustainable on a go-forward basis. So cutting a tree to produce only lumber, pulp, or paper may not be sustainable over the long term. And so companies are starting to look in earnest at opportunities to diversify their cash flows and their lines of business. And certainly moving from a value-added concept of a value-added business to a value-extracted business, and that's the notion of using the entire tree and the revenues that can bring. So pursuing opportunities in the bioeconomy is something that shows a lot of promise for our industry, but that can mean so many different things to so many different companies that about a year ago, FPAC said, well, we want to take a look at this with our member companies to try and figure out what this means for each of them in particular. So we launched a project that we call the Biopathways Project. Again, recognizing that the current business model may not be sustainable over the long term, and recognizing that there may be opportunities in the bioeconomy and bioenergy. So the project was about a couple of things. It was about helping industry identify the right transformational pathways and how to pursue those opportunities. And it was about giving us, as an association, the information we need to lobby governments to make sure that they're getting enabling policies and programs right to help us pursue some of these opportunities in the short term, in the midterm, and in fact, the long term. So just a bit more about the project, if I could. It was about, well, it's ongoing, but we've been working on it for about 14 months to date. The first phase was completed earlier in 2010. Year-long collaboration between FPAC and our member companies, the federal government, provincial governments in Quebec, Ontario, and BC, academics, bankers, technology providers, and our National Research Institute on the forestry side, FP Innovations. So the first phase of the project, which I mentioned was completed earlier this year, was about 3 things in particular. It was about assessing the market readiness of the emerging bioenergy and chemical technology, so looking at what's out there and what may make sense in terms of technology applications for our industry. It was about looking at financial